Our people observed a major holiday this past week. Does anyone know what it was? It was movie night. It was Chinese food and movie night. Now, there are many folks in this community who are celebrating or have celebrated Christmas with family, and we hope that it was a wonderful and special occasion for all of you. In our house, we decided to do something that we wanted to do up in LA, but we never managed to figure out how to make the timing work, which was on Christmas Eve. Has anyone ever been to the Lemley on Christmas Eve? Does anyone know what I'm talking about? There is a Fiddler on the Roof sing-along on Christmas Eve. Now, I've seen Fiddler at Segerstrom Hall, starring Topol. I've seen the video of the Purim spiel from last year, but somehow I had made it to almost 40 years old without ever having viewed the film all the way through in its entirety. I know, shocking, right? I tried a few times when I was young, but my grandmother intervened because the subject matter is a little challenging for a small child. But as an adult, I was brought to see it at Segerstrom. To refresh your memory, if you need refreshing, there might be one person here or two who might. The story takes place around 1905. And the Jews living in the Pale of Settlement in Russia are being brutalized and expelled through pogroms and edicts. And a branch of my own family traces its immigration to the United States to this period. Throughout the story, the main character is followed around by a mad fiddler, representing a downturn in fortune. Tevye, played by the legendary actor Chaim Topol, explains that we are an eternally persecuted people teetering on the edge of falling off of the roof and breaking our necks, like the eponymous fiddler. So I was surprised to discover that the situation for Jews in Russia had been relatively stable, indeed upwardly mobile, until the end of the reign of Tsar Alexander II, when he was assassinated. And does anyone know? That was a different Tsar. This is Alexander II in 1881. And unfortunately, this Tsar, who was considered to be permissive and progressive by Tsar standards, was assassinated by a group of revolutionaries prominently featuring a Jew named Hessia Helfman. And she was involved in the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. And Alexander II's son, Alexander III, reversed all of his father's tolerant views towards Jews, who had been moving to St. Petersburg and getting educated and dressing and assimilating and joining Russian culture, and he reversed all of that. And he confined the Jews to the Pale, what was called the Pale of Settlement, only certain specific areas that we could live, and introduced something called the May Laws. Does anyone know what the May Laws are? They're pretty nasty laws, discriminatory laws against Jews. Now, I've always been slightly confused by the message of Fiddler on the Roof. Perhaps it's because there is no fiddler in the original Shalom Aleichem stories. The fiddler comes from, does anyone know? No. Do you know where the image is drawn from? Anybody? That's right. Say it louder.
Chagall.
All right, I have a ringer. The image is a Marc Chagall work, and you can see a fiddler sitting on a roof, and this idea was borrowed and combined with the stories of Shalom Aleichem and turned in, and they were sort of knitted together into what we know as Fiddler on the Roof. But in the same way that The Lion King is Hamlet with a happy ending, Fiddler on the Roof is the Tevye the Milkman stories, but with certain alterations. I should mention that I consider this to be one of the central texts of American Judaism, Fiddler on the Roof. So I approach this with great trepidation. In Fiddler on the Roof, there's no place for the assimilated or intermarried or politically active Jews in the town of. Thank you. Being politically active only brings danger to the Jews. Perchik, the communist agitator, is in the film partially responsible for the attacks against the Jews of Anatevka. It is considered to be retaliation, the end of the film. But when we as Jews watch this musical, we are spared some of the brutality of this period that my family remembers in our repressed trauma. And also for non-Jews who go to Fiddler and who sing along at the Lemley, as I was mentioning, it is an illustration of us as Jews as the eternally suffering people. We are forced to flee from place to place, and we are happy to salt our Shabbos dinner with our tears. Indeed, at the end of the film, in the song Anatevka, never did the Shabbos taste so sweet as when salted with their tears. And so, for non-Jews watching this musical, the Jews are non-threatening and much easier to understand than the modern assimilated American Jew. And even more confusing for non-Jews watching this film is the Israeli Jew, who looks and sounds and acts very little like the Jews of Anatevka. We Jews are supposed to be the victims in every situation. In this week's Torah portion, Vayechi, the story picks up around the death of the patriarch Jacob. Jacob is in Egypt and he is surrounded by all of his children, and although he had feared his son Joseph was dead, Jacob states that he is overjoyed that God has permitted him to reunite not only with Joseph, but to see Joseph's children, Ephraim and Manasseh. That would be Jacob's grandchildren. And so Jacob invites Joseph to bring the two boys forward for a blessing before he dies, as you do in the Torah and in most operas. And so the two boys come forward, and Jacob reaches out to put his hands on their heads. And does anyone remember, for extra credit, what he does? That's right. He crosses his hands and puts Judaism favors the right-hand side, just like Latin. Does anyone know what it's called in Latin? Dexter and sinister, right? So we favor the right hand. So he puts his right hand on the younger son, which is very much preferring the younger son to the older son, which is exactly what happened in his case. We might remember a few weeks ago we read about Jacob being victimized by and stealing the birthright of his repressive, muscular older brother. The Midrash suggests that we as Jews prefer brain over brawn, to use our heads, which is why Esau, Jacob's brother, is described in the Torah as a big, hairy, violent brute. And he is also considered by the Midrash, by our exegesis, what we would call rabbinic fan fiction, he is considered to be the progenitor of, does anyone know which nation he is the progenitor of? But then later, after the Edomites, one of Judaism's most challenging and repressive people that conquered us. Earlier than Islam, later than the Amalekites, later than Alexander the Great. You're missing the biggest empire, most famous empire in the world, the Romans. That's right. Jacob, the brainy, thoughtful, sensitive kid. The Jews being victimized by the Romans, oppressing and destroying our temple and so on. And the pattern of the younger sibling overtaking the older sibling, this kind of fantasy that we have of overtaking our oppressors. We see it again and again in the Torah. Isaac overtakes Ishmael. Moses overtakes Aaron. Solomon overtakes his brother Adoniah. That's not in the Torah, though. That's later. Over and over again, we see the younger, wiser child outwitting and overtaking the older child. This is hard for me to read because I am the oldest sibling in my family. In her book, The Trauma of the Gifted Child, the noted psychologist Alice Miller explains that parents can imprint negative behavior patterns and indeed crippling fears on their children, passing trauma from one generation to the next. If the parents view themselves as victims, the children will pick this up through our behavior and even without needing to be told. And they will carry it in themselves, in their posture, in the way they act in the world without necessarily realizing they are doing so. And this can create a dissonance between reality and someone's self-perception. Alice Miller explains that a family needs to create what she calls a stop generation. That is, a generation that examines itself and the myths and stories it tells about itself that have been passed from parents to children and so on, in order to check that there's still an honest assessment of the world around you. And this way, we don't live in dissonance with the world around us if we do this kind of thoughtful reflection. And that way we can avoid carrying out patterns where we become victimized, or we become oppressive, or we become whatever it is that we're not aware we are doing. In most psychology manuals and in a psychologist's office, this is represented by a human being covering their eyes with their own hands, not wanting to look at the way that they're acting. Now in Fiddler on the Roof, the Jews are driven out of Anatevka. The final scene closes with the idea that the Jews have always been persecuted and have always fled from place to place, which for us rings true and also rings true for people who are looking at us from the outside. But Tevye at the very end is played off stage by the fiddler, who looks very much like the plague man from medieval drawings. He's gaunt. He kind of leans, you remember it from, he kind of staggers like a corpse. And in medieval art, the bubonic plague was represented by a skeleton or a sort of zombie that walks like that. It's a kind of callback to that art. He's a harbinger of death to come. And the characters hope that when they get to the Golden Medina, to America, where there are no cats, I'm sorry, that's another film. When they get to America, perhaps they will be freed from the perpetual cycles of violence. But the viewer, that is all of us, know that that is not true, because Tevye is followed off stage at the end by the fiddler, representing the difficulties that we faced trying to integrate into this society here, and possibly a reference to what will happen to the Jews of Europe a few decades later. It is through repeating these stories that we can sometimes create self-fulfilling prophecies. I believe that Fiddler on the Roof is one of our people's most beloved texts, our most beloved sacred stories that we tell ourselves. But it is only through a deep and honest examination of our most beloved stories and the behavior patterns that those stories accept as normal that we will be able to be a stop generation and not unduly pass on trauma from one generation to the next. And I would be willing to wager, if you are willing to discuss with me the authorship and the politics of the Torah, that you might say I might dare to approach an even holier text, Fiddler on the Roof. The reality of Jews in the Russian Empire was complex. We experienced periods of peaceful assimilation as well as persecution. And if you've ever seen photographs of them, there are some synagogues in Imperial Russia where the Ner Tamid, the eternal light, was fashioned in the shape of the imperial double eagle. Just like we have the flags. We have one flag. We're missing the other flag. Is it over there behind the thing? American flag. So as we show our loyalty to the United States, so too they did to the Tsar when the Tsar was nice. And when the Tsar was not nice, you had to show your loyalty even more. Now in Fiddler on the Roof, the revolutionary Jew Perchik is sentenced to the Siberian prison camps for his plot against the Tsar. Like Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, he's shipped off to be married in Siberia, and to, as Raskolnikov does, find a kind of religious absolution, because Perchik is to be married to his bride under a chuppah by a rabbi, because as Tevye tells us, surely there's one or two rabbis in the Gulag too. In reality, yes, Jews participated in attempts to overthrow the Tsars. Hessia Helfman was a Jew. Trotsky was a Jew. Marx was a Jew. Ayn Rand was also a Jew. So we're not confined to any one part of the philosophical or political spectrum. The oppressive laws, though, and the programs of Alexander III drove part of my own family out of corners of the Russian Empire, and possibly some of your families also. So how do we feel when we watch a film or see a musical or do a Purim spiel that shows Jews almost like the mice from Cinderella, sitting on the sidelines, sewing and tailoring and milking our cows, hoping that no one comes to murder us? So much of the modern relationship between American Jews and Israeli Jews is built on the presumption that it is better to die on our feet than to live on our knees. How would Tevye fit in to modern Israel with its shopping malls and Jewish soldiers? The founders of the State of Israel had little love for the shtetl culture of places like Anatevka. And in fact, during the revival of Hebrew as a modern language, Eliezer ben Yehuda, author of the first modern Hebrew dictionary, was raising his son Itamar to be the first native-born speaker of Hebrew. He spoke only Hebrew to his son. Eliezer refused to use any loan words from Yiddish or Arabic or German, believing that they would infect the purity of the Israelite biblical character with memories of diaspora oppression. And one day, while eating breakfast with his son Itamar, Eliezer's breakfast was undersalted, and he wanted to ask his son to pass the salt. Unfortunately, as the author of the modern Hebrew dictionary, he had not yet come up with the entry for salt. And so he ate his food unsalted until he was able to track down an old man who was able to teach him the word for salt. Better to be what Alice Miller called a stop generation. Better to eat your food plain than salted with the tears of Anatevka. To be honest, Tevye and his family seem nothing like the people I see before me tonight, with the exception that we can't get that song out of our heads. You know the one? We got If I Were a Rich Man. What else? Tradition? Nobody? Great. We can't get the song out of our heads. But the people I'm looking at tonight are much closer to the educated, metropolitan, urbane Jews of Alexander II's reign than the villagers of Anatevka during the reign of Alexander III. We tonight here are integrated, tolerant, and inclusive. We are fully enfranchised citizens of the United States. And we, here tonight, could not be farther from Anatevka. Shabbat Shalom.